All right, guys. This week, Nets GM Sean Marks said that it's possible both Ben Simmons and Kevin Durant could be ready to play next week. When we finally do see both guys on the court, what kind of impact will that have in the land of DFS, Garion?
Yeah, it's going to be pretty substantial. Obviously, you're going to have a situation where, Ben Simmons probably isn't going to be the highest usage player in the world, but, also if we factor in, Eric Adams coming out yesterday and saying that New York is in the process of removing its vaccination requirement, like Kyrie is probably going to be back in the mix on a daily basis too. So you're going to have the two tent poles of that offense, Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, with usage rates hovering somewhere between 25 and 35%. You're going to have Ben Simmons on the court quite a bit. I mean, really, the biggest impact is just going to be the fact that Cam Thomas, Patty Mills, and Seth Curry are no longer going to be viable options in the 4K to 6K range. Other than that, I'm just kind of curious to see how Ben Simmons sort of augments this offense. I mean, he is someone who is obviously not the most adept offensive player in the half court. They've mentioned several times, they being the Nets, that they like how he profiles as someone who can attack in the transition and really implement that style of game into what they already have. So do they become a team that's like a top 5 pace team in the NBA? How much does he actually improve their defense? I mean, one of the easiest aspects of DFS for the first 4 months of the season has been, all right, is someone playing Brooklyn? They're probably going to have a pretty good game because they cannot defend anybody. So does Simmons make them a faster pace team, and does he make them a better defense, are kind of two of the big questions for me going forward.
All right, cool. Whalen, where do you sit on this, man? Like, evaluating the fantasy value of, like, Nets players not named, like, really Irving or Durant could be difficult here moving forward.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, obviously, I think Simmons is the linchpin here. It depends what version of Ben Simmons we're getting. Are we getting a confident version of Ben Simmons? Is it going to take him several weeks to kind of get back into the flow? I thought it was interesting that at practice earlier this week, Steve Nash said he thinks Kevin Durant is closer to returning to game action than Ben Simmons. Kevin Durant is injured with a knee injury. Ben Simmons has kind of been hanging out for most of the last year. So that tells me that maybe Ben Simmons is not in the greatest shape. Maybe there's going to be some kind of basketball reconditioning. I mean, even guys like us who play pickup basketball, if you don't play for a while, it takes you, several games, several days to kind of feel back, get that comfortability back. And obviously that's exacerbated when you're on an NBA stage. So I've been kind of saying all along since they made this trade, I don't necessarily trust that Ben Simmons is just going to switch teams and all of a sudden be back to, first team all defense, great passer, triple double threat. I think it's going to take some time. So, how that affects the guys around him, we'll see. And it's also worth noting that, there were some pretty interesting comments from New York City Mayor Eric Adams yesterday, essentially implying that vaccine mandate will likely be lifted at some point in the next month. So maybe that doesn't really have that much of an effect with the regular season since there's only 7 weeks left. But I think we're going to get to a point where Kyrie Irving is going to end up being a full-time player for this Nets team.
Yeah, Maddie, New York does plan to start phasing out its vaccine mandate here in the coming weeks, but another impact with these two dudes when they eventually return to the floor, several role players could see their production drop.
Yeah, it's going to be pretty game by game for me, though, because I think this is kind of to what these guys have been talking about. We don't know how healthy Ben Simmons is. Like, is he going to play every game? Is Kyrie Irving going to still get rest games? Kevin Durant, I think, almost certainly will sit some games during the duration of the season because just the number of injury concerns he's had over the last 3 or 4 years. So on the nights where all of these guys are in, they're not going to be a very interesting team from a DFS perspective. They just have too many names and too many guys to take shots. But on the other nights, assuming that the prices on the role players come down as a result of this, on the other nights where you get, let's say, Kevin Durant resting, then Seth Curry, Patty Mills, James Johnson, whoever else, these guys are going to be a lot more appealing than even they are currently because the prices are going to go a lot lower. So it's going to be a very different Nets situation, very different analysis each game because I think the situations are just going to be very different night over night.
Ooh.
All right, guys, Suns point guard Chris Paul is expected to miss 6 to 8 weeks with a fracture on his right thumb. So, what's the trickle-down effect of Paul's absence, either in DFS or Sportsbook, Nick? I mean, obviously, with Paul out, Devin Booker going to be leaned on more here.
Yeah, I mean, the Suns obviously have leaned extremely heavily on Chris Paul since he arrived. He's missed, I think, 2 games in a Suns uniform, and I think both of those were for rest purposes. last season. So, I mean, this is a guy that was missing 20 plus games seemingly every year in the middle of his prime, and all of a sudden he's in his late 30s and he becomes this Iron Man. So, he's single-handedly dragged this team from like a 35-win team to the best team in the league. There's going to be an adjustment period no matter what. In terms of depth, they kind of a good thing, I guess, that they picked up a guy like Aaron Holiday at the deadline. Not that that's going to be a huge difference maker, but Cameron Payne still not fully recovered from his injury. He hasn't played in several months. So we might see Aaron Holiday start in their first game after the break. You still have Elfrid Payton, not an option that you're super excited about. Both Holiday and Payton could be interesting DFS plays in the short term. But ultimately, I think we see more of Devin Booker as the primary playmaker. And keep in mind that before Chris Paul arrived, Devin Booker essentially functioned as the Phoenix Suns point guard for almost a full season back in 2019-20. And in that season, he played 70 games. He averaged 36 minutes a game, 6.5 assists per game. And even in the season before that, when they started experimenting with Booker at point guard, he was almost at 7 assists per game. So in terms of individual production, I'm not in love with like going, playing campaign in DFS, playing Aaron Holiday, playing Elfrid Payton. I think all those guys have pretty low ceilings. I think this is going to be pretty big, though, for Devin Booker's value. As long as he can stay healthy going forward, I think he's the guy that gets the biggest boost.
Matt, when Paul is on the floor, Phoenix averages 115.9 points per 100 possessions. Without him, that number drops to 104.9. I mean,
Damn.
you can't really overstate how big of a loss this is.
Yeah, it's definitely a big loss. Although I think there's some noise to the stats like that. For instance, when Paul's not on the court, it's less likely that the game is close. Like they may just be playing garbage time for a lot of those minutes. And then also it's definitely more of a problem this year than it's been in years past because Cameron Payne's been injured. That's really the key here for me. If Payne comes back, I'm not as worried about Chris Paul. Like that drop off from Paul all the way down to Elfrid Payton and Aaron Holiday, I think is huge. And I think the 10 points less per 100 possessions, that is probably a realistic assessment of what might happen. But with Cameron Payne playing, I think we see him kind of bridge that gap, and then it'll be just a small drop off, but not a major one. But Devin Booker, yeah, I think this is where we're going to see the biggest change with the Suns. He's averaging 4.5 assists per game this year. His over-under for assists tonight is 6.5 with the over at -150. We're essentially expecting 2.5 to 3 more assists out of Booker over his season average just because Paul's not there. There's not really anything else different about the Suns aside from that. So I think he functionally will be this team's point guard. I think even if Aaron Holiday is a starter, Holiday's probably the shooting guard. So we may see Booker actually score less, pass more, be double-teamed more. It'll create a different dynamic with the Suns. But as long as Cameron Payne can get back out there in the next week or two, I don't think it affects the Suns too much in the standings. I think it's going to affect the way that their production is spread out game to game.
Garion, talk to me.
Yeah, just going to kind of echo what these guys are saying. I mean, you've got a situation where I guess in the immediate future, like tonight, you can use Aaron Holiday because he's like $3,700 and he's probably going to play 25 to 30 minutes because Cameron Payne is unavailable. But when Cameron Payne comes back, Payne is first and foremost probably going to be the immediate replacement in the starting lineup for Chris Paul as soon as he's ready. But you're going to start seeing that reflected in their price points. I think whether it's Holiday, whether it's Payne, they're going to get up to that high 4K, low 5K range, and they're just not going to be all that enticing a DFS option on a night-to-night basis because Devin Booker is going to be the point guard. I mean, one of the biggest reasons Devin Booker took a massive hit in his season-long value as soon as the Suns acquired Chris Paul was, as these guys talked about, he went from someone who was, hovering around like a 34 to 35% assist rate, and that's been down around 20% playing alongside Paul these last 2 seasons. This is someone who has been amazing across his last 18 games, and in those 18 games, when the possessions and minutes he's played without Chris Paul, he's got a 38% usage rate, and he's averaging 1.4 DraftKings points per minute. So this is now just Devin Booker's world. There really isn't like a trickle-down effect that entices me in DFS. It's just Devin Booker is now going to take on much more of a role than his already substantial role for Phoenix. So that's really the 1A and 1B effect here.
And then, guys, in the city of brotherly love here, we should see the debut of James Harden sometime soon. How do you think his addition is going to impact Embiid on the floor, though, Matt?
I think it could be pretty significant. Embiid is the clear favorite right now for MVP at plus 130. but his usage has to drop with James Harden there. There's just no way he can continue to shoot as much as he's been shooting with the addition of someone like Harden. I mean, I think the Sixers will try to stagger the minutes and get it so that one of them is on the court at all times and try to space them out as much as possible. But I don't see this being a two-man game type of combination where James Harden and Joel Embiid are running pick and rolls and Harden is throwing him alley-oops and all. Maybe that happens once every so often, but these are two isolation type players. And I think any possession where James Harden is shooting, Joel Embiid is probably kind of just standing and watching or trying to fight for a rebound. Like, we're not going to see too much synergy between these two players. I think Philly will be fine despite that. These are two of the best one-on-one basketball players in the NBA. But if Embiid's stats start to come down, which I think they will, we're going to see more talk about Nikola Jokic, who I think is rightfully deserving of the MVP now. He's just, I think, the best player in the league from a value perspective. Doesn't have the narrative of Embiid, but if Embiid's production starts to fall just due to having less shot attempts, I think we may see Jokic actually pass him in the MVP race at some point.
Yeah, Gary, and the superstar big man averaging a league-high 29.4 points per game here to go with north of 10 rebounds, north of 4 assists. How do you think this will affect his MVP candidacy?
Yeah, I mean, we sort of talked about this yesterday when we were just talking about who we thought was going to win MVP, who had the best odds. And, you know, I'll echo what Matt was saying. I think Jokic is the deserving MVP right now. But when we talk about Embiid's production, I guess it should be said that he's at such a high level that when there is going to be a drop-off, because there has to be, this is someone whose usage rate is about 41% since the beginning of January, which is absurd. And you even mentioned, Emerson, the assist numbers. I mean, a lot of that is just Embiid getting the ball in the post and being double or triple teamed and being able to find a wide open shooter virtually anywhere on the court. That's going to happen just less now based on the fact that James Harden is going to be standing on the other side of the court, and Harden's going to have the ball in his hands quite a bit more often than anyone else, you know, your Tyrese Maxeys of the world. So this is going to affect his overall numbers, but it is a high place to have some slippage. So I don't think suddenly he's going to be averaging like 20 and 7. He's still going to have some pretty impressive numbers. And I think it was Nick who pointed this out yesterday. For as much drop-off in terms of his MVP as you might see from the raw statistical side of things, if the Sixers just reel off like 11 straight wins and become the number 1 seed in the East, which is, you know, it's still very much up for grabs, that could definitely be, along with just being like the team everyone is going to be watching the last 2 months of the season, that really could help his MVP odds in the long run.
All right, Nick, he's joining a team run by the man who constructed that Rockets uber-efficient offense, too. He's back with Daryl Morey right now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of going to echo what Garion said and what I said yesterday, which is I think Embiid's numbers are going to drop by default. You're bringing in one of the highest usage players in NBA history in James Harden. And like Matt said, you know, I think in theory you're like, oh, yeah, they'll just run pick and roll and nobody will be able to stop it. That's not really what Joel Embiid does. Like, he still wants to do a lot of isolation. You know, he doesn't want to just turn into, you know, like a souped up version of Clint Capella. That's not who Joel Embiid is. So I think it could be a little clunky at first, but, you know, ultimately, if Joel Embiid's going to win the MVP award, his numbers either have to sustain, which in my opinion is somewhat unlikely. I think he can do 90%, 85% of what he's doing right now, but it has to be offset by the Sixers being a really good team, because I think part of the narrative, or part of the reason that Joel Embiid is ahead of Nikola Jokic right now is there's this thought that, like, oh, he's on a vastly better team. You know, Philly's 3rd in the East, Denver's all the way down at 6th in the West. I mean, they're only separated by what, like 2 games in the standings? Philly's 35 and 23, Denver 33 and 25. So it's not like there's this huge gap here. So, you know, if Philly struggles a little bit to integrate Harden and Denver goes on a run and you can kind of throw out the records and that's no longer a part of it, I think that ultimately ends up favoring Jokic. Although the one thing we haven't mentioned is that eventually Jamal Murray, at some point in the next month, it sounds like, is going to be back on the floor for Denver. I don't think that's going to have as much of an impact as James Harden joining the 76ers, but still something to keep in mind that probably takes at least a little bit of usage away from Nikola Jokic.
All right, guys, quickly on this last one. The Lakers come out of the break 27-31, sitting in 9th place in the West. Anthony Davis going to be out at least a month with a foot injury. Russell Westbrook continuously riding the bench. LeBron doing everything he can, right? Averaging a career high 29 points per game. But this team is in danger of missing the playoffs, and you can bet on that right now on the DK Sportsbook. Actually, minus 135 to miss, plus 105 to make it. Which one would you bet on right now, Gary? And LeBron has only missed the playoffs 3 times in his career.
Damn.
I'm going to bet on them to make it, and it's simply because the Lakers are going to get to the play-in. Like, they're on an island right now. They are 6 games back of the 6th seed, but they've got a pretty comfy cushion on the 10 seed, considering, like, the team currently in the 10 spot doesn't want to be there and told their best player yesterday, hey, you're hurt. Trust us. You're hurt. So they're probably going to end up having, like, the 2 one-game playoffs. The first one's going to be against Sacramento, and the second one, yeah, maybe it's against, like, Minnesota, who's frisky. Maybe it is against the Clippers, who have got one of their 2-star players back. But at the end of the day, if you're telling me one side has LeBron James and probably a healthy Anthony Davis by that point, I'm just going to take that team in a 1-game playoff, regardless of where that game is taking place. So I think they end up making the playoffs. They don't make a lot of noise once they get into it, but they do win the play-in.
Nick, which side are you on?
I'm out on this Lakers team. I can't do it anymore. I don't think they make it. I think, who knows which of the big 3 is even going to be available at that point. Anthony Davis is basically 50-50 to make it through any game that he starts at this point. I don't see some sort of miraculous turnaround chemistry-wise happening over these last 24 games. By that point, the Clippers will likely have Paul George back. Maybe they would have Kawhi Leonard back. So if that's the case and that's the matchup to get in, I think the Clippers win that. And even Minnesota. I mean, right now, you look at that Minnesota roster, top to bottom. Yeah, the Lakers maybe have the 2 best players when Davis and LeBron are healthy in that series, but Minnesota much, much deeper. One thing that I think has flown under the radar with the Lakers is, not only has Davis been injured, Westbrook has struggled, but pretty much every single role player for them has been terrible. And, other teams are just so much deeper when you look at like the 3 through 10 positions. So maybe LeBron and Davis can carry the Lakers in a 1-game playoff, but man, right now it's really hard to put faith in this team. So I'll say they miss.
Matt, in or out on the Lakers?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you have to know at this point I'm going out on the Lakers still. This has been my favorite question to answer for basically the entire season. I think it's just too narrow of a path for them to get in. They need everything to go right. First of all, they need to win most likely 2 play-in games in a row. The first of the 2 may be against an inferior opponent like the Pelicans or the Spurs or the Kings, or maybe the Blazers, who may not have Yusuf Nurkic still at that point. But they have to win 2 of those, and the second one is likely Minnesota or the LA Clippers with Paul George. Both of those are better teams than the healthy Lakers. But then the other concern is Anthony Davis is hurt. LeBron James has been dealing with injuries all season. The idea that we can just guarantee that both of them will be healthy at that point, like, that just seems crazy to me. It may even be more likely than not that one of them is still out at that point. And also with just how many more minutes and how much more usage LeBron is going to have while Davis is out. I mean, if there's something that can increase LeBron's injury risk in the near future, it's not having Anthony Davis there to take off some of that burden. And if LeBron sees Russell Westbrook start to take on more of the offense and do poorly, LeBron's just not going to give him the ball as much and try to just do more himself. The chances of LeBron and Davis both staying healthy to me are nowhere near 100%. So for all of those reasons, just something probably goes wrong for this team. And yeah, I think even at minus 130, minus 135, whatever it is now, I still would bet them not to make the playoffs.
I do like how you guys are both basically like, oh, LeBron and AD probably won't be there. But yeah, Paul George, just a beacon of health. Paul George is definitely going to be
Fair
playing